The consent order was already on our breakfast table when the email from New York came through, glowing quietly on my laptop like a life I had not dared to touch. Russell Carden wanted my memoir. The one I had written under a name Grant Bellamy never bothered to remember, because he never believed my private work could become public power. I read the first line 3 times, then heard my husband in the next room telling Kendra Wills, "She'll sign if we keep it clean and make her feel tired." My hand stayed on the laptop, but something inside me moved backward from the woman who would have walked in begging for an explanation. Grant had left the papers where I would find them, stacked beside my coffee mug, as if divorce was just another household errand I had forgotten to finish. The top page said consent order in clean black print, and beneath it sat a draft settlement that treated 6 years of marriage like shared furniture. From his office, Kendra's voice slipped through the half-open door, low and certain. "Do it before she starts telling people you used her work." Grant answered too fast. "Meredith does edits. Kendra, not books. And nobody builds a career out of cleaning up other people's sentences." That was the moment the email in front of me stopped feeling like rescue and started feeling like evidence I needed to protect. I closed the laptop before either of them could see the publisher's name, then slid the consent order closer and read every line while my pulse steadied. Grant walked in wearing the careful face he used for difficult clients, and I looked up before he could perform grief. "If you want me to sign something, Grant, make sure your lawyer sends a version worth reading," I said, and his practiced sadness cracked at the edges. He blinked like calm had offended him, then placed one hand on the chair across from me and softened his voice into something almost tender. "I don't want this to get ugly. Meredith," he murmured, and I nodded, because ugly had already happened behind a door he forgot to close. I folded the papers once, keeping my thumb over the line where my future had been reduced to marital terms. "Then don't make it dishonest," I answered, while the unread acceptance letter waited inside my laptop, untouched by the man who had just called me nothing. Grant did not sit down, because sitting would have made the papers between us look like something we were allowed to discuss. He stayed near the counter, wedding ring still on. Using careful breath, he saved for clients who knew bad news. "We have been living separate lives. Meredith," he began, while his eyes avoided the laptop I had closed before he entered. The man who remembered Kendra's tea order, her agency gossip, and restaurant lighting she hated suddenly could not remember who edited his career. I kept one hand on the consent order, not to claim it, but to stop myself from pushing it back too soon. He talked about clean endings, emotional distance, and mutual respect. Words so polished, they sounded rehearsed before he entered. "You deserve peace," he added, and the line landed wrong because nothing peaceful had come from the half-open office door. Then he slipped and said, "Kendra thinks this is healthier," before his mouth tightened around the name he had finally brought into our marriage. I did not flinch, because the wrong name had done more work than any accusation I could have made. "Then Kendra should be relieved when your lawyer sends a better draft," I answered, sliding the papers into a neat stack. Grant tried to recover, telling me nobody wanted a fight. Nobody wanted reputations damaged. Nobody needed private pain turned public. I looked at the man who had just named his affair in our kitchen and understood why he needed silence more than forgiveness. The email from Russell waited behind my closed screen, and I could feel its weight without touching the keyboard. Grant wanted the divorce to look merciful, because mercy made him clean and made me small enough to leave behind. "I will read everything before I sign," I told him, and his relief came too quickly, grateful before he understood. By the time he left the kitchen, he thought I had accepted the ending, when all I accepted was that he would never again edit mine. By noon, I was in Patricia Mallory's office with the consent order, Russell's email, and 6 years of marriage folded into one brown envelope. Trish read without theatrics, her silver pen moving only when evidence deserved ink, not when my voice tried to shake. "He wants silence dressed up as dignity," she murmured, tapping the clause that limited what I could say after divorce. I told her Grant had called my work editing, not books, and she looked at Russell's offer like the room had finally produced a clean fact. "Then we make sure he signs away the right to discover its value later," she answered, and I breathed for the first time all morning. Trish did not promise revenge, because real lawyers with real reputations do not sell women fairy tales across polished desks. She explained that our settlement could separate marital property from individual creative work, future royalties, unpublished manuscripts, pen names, and opportunities neither spouse had disclosed. "We are not hiding assets," she warned, and I nodded because the book was not money yet, only a signed door beginning to open. What we could do was make the language mutual, clean, and boring enough for Grant to underestimate it. He wanted the house neat, the story quiet, and the divorce fast, so the paper would give him exactly that. 2 days later, his lawyer sent the revised draft back with almost no resistance, and that told me Grant had read the wrong parts carefully. He cared about furniture, shared accounts, the public statement, and the sentence claiming neither party admitted fault. He did not care about creative rights, because in his mind, my notebooks had always been decoration beside his career. When Trish asked if I was ready, I watched her place the final settlement in front of me and heard Grant in my kitchen saying nobody built a career cleaning sentences. I signed after reading every page, every paragraph, every word that kept my future outside his reach. Grant signed faster, his name hard and careless, like the paper was only a door out of inconvenience. "Clean ending," he whispered when the copies were separated, and I gave him the smile he had expected from a tired wife. He left believing silence had been purchased, while the book he never respected sat protected under the one document he was too arrogant to fear. The week after Grant signed, I drove south until Portland's rain thinned into desert light, with the settlement sealed beside Russell's email in my bag. Santa Fe did not ask who left me, and that mercy felt strange, after months of hearing my marriage translated into Grant's language. Celeste Marrow opened the back door of her bookstore before sunrise, handed me coffee, and pointed toward a scratched table near poetry. "Right there before the customers come," she offered, as if she were giving me a room without asking for one confession back. For 3 mornings, I sat in that quiet store and edited my memoir while dust moved slowly through the pale window light. My suitcase stayed half open at the casita. My phone stayed face down. And Grant's public version reached me through other people's careful voices. He and Kendra were telling Portland friends our divorce had been mutual, gentle, mature, because I needed distance from his growing career. Celeste heard one message play from my speaker, then closed the shop door and turned the lock without changing her expression. "That story can wait outside," she said, and the small click of the lock did what my anger had not. It gave the room a boundary Grant could not charm. Kendra could not enter, and pity could not turn into gossip. I wanted to answer every lie, but the signed settlement sat in my bag, and Russell's email waited in the folder marked clean. So I kept writing, because the only version that mattered now had to survive legal review, not dinner table sympathy from people. By the end of that week, I learned how silence felt when it was chosen instead of forced onto my mouth. Celeste never called me brave, which helped, because brave would have sounded too large for a woman learning to sleep again. She only refilled my coffee, circled awkward lines in pencil, and asked whether the chapter still sounded like me when read aloud. When I finally finished one paragraph without hearing Grant correct it, the bookstore stayed locked, and my own name sounded real again. Russell's legal team sent back the first marked draft on a Thursday morning, and every red line felt like a door being measured twice. They removed names, softened locations, checked dates, and kept only the parts of the marriage that belonged to my own memory. Russell called before lunch, his voice careful, not gentle, because publishing had rules that sympathy could not bend. The book survives if the facts survive. He reminded me, and I wrote that sentence on a yellow pad beside Trish's number. Kendra began circling 3 days later, quiet enough to look harmless if someone wanted her to be harmless. Her email arrived with a subject line about old contacts, but every sentence leaned toward the manuscript she pretended not to know existed. She hoped I was well, wondered whether I was working again, and mentioned that certain stories could become complicated inside a small industry. "Let me know if you ever want a friendly read." She wrote, and the friendliness looked exactly like a hand reaching through a locked drawer. I did not answer her, because silence chosen with counsel felt different from silence forced by Grant's draft. I forwarded the email to Trish and Russell, then placed a printed copy behind the settlement, where quiet business could become documented business. Trish responded with one line, "Do not engage. Preserve the thread." And that was enough instruction for my hands to stop shaking. By sunset, Russell confirmed legal review would continue under my pen name, and Kendra's message would sit nowhere near the book she wanted to touch. That night, I read the revised chapter aloud in Celeste's locked bookstore, hearing my own voice move cleanly through sentences Grant had never valued. Celeste listened from the register, pencil between her fingers, then looked up only when I reached the paragraph about being made small. "That sounds like you," she offered, and those 4 words did more than praise the page. They told me the book was not becoming revenge, scandal, or rumor, but proof that my life could still be written in my own hand. The meeting was public only in the way publishing makes private rooms feel witnessed, with every handshake carrying somebody's future inside it. Russell brought me to a New York booksellers forum, where editors, agents, and store owners traded careful opinions over coffee and folded programs. My badge showed my pen name beneath Meredith Ashford, and the printed schedule listed my memoir as a fall lead title. I saw Grant before he saw me, standing beside Kendra, with the posture of a man entering a room he expected to use. For a few minutes, I watched him work the crowd like he once worked our dinner table, smiling until polish passed for substance. Kendra leaned toward a paperback distributor, professional enough to seem harmless, while her eyes kept returning to the program in my hand. Then Russell touched my elbow and introduced me as the author his imprint had been building toward all season. Grant's smile held for 1 second too long, then broke in the small, visible way a room remembers without needing applause. He reached me near the coffee urn, choosing a corner that let him look calm while keeping Kendra close enough to listen. "Meredith, we should discuss this before it becomes complicated," he said, and I heard the old habit underneath his politeness. I looked at his badge, then at Kendra, the woman who had once offered to give my work a friendly read. "The complicated part was handled in the settlement you signed," I answered, and Kendra's fingers tightened around her glass. Russell did not raise his voice, but he stepped in with the kind of authority that made performance unnecessary. "All rights and legal review are complete," he said, and that sentence landed cleaner than any accusation I could have made. Grant tried smiling at the booksellers nearest us, but nobody moved closer, and one agent quietly checked the program again. By the time the next panel began, he stood beside Kendra, holding the same silence he had once tried to sell me. Grant's lawyer wrote first, which told me he still believed distance could make arrogance sound official on letterhead. The letter claimed my memoir appeared to draw from marital experiences, implied reputational harm, and requested advance review before publication. Trish sent it to me without panic, adding only, "Do not respond emotionally to a document written for leverage." I read it once in Celeste's back office. With the bookstore closed around me, and my pen name printed on Russell's schedule beside my real one, the name was the part Grant could not keep buried. Because the industry had started connecting Meredith Ashford to work he had dismissed for years. Russell had not announced scandal, only authorship, And that made Grant's complaint look smaller than the room he wanted to control. Trish's response went out before lunch, attaching the signed settlement, the creative rights clause, the manuscript timeline, and Russell's acceptance email dated before Grant's final signature. He released any claim, she wrote, and the sentence felt plain enough to survive any courtroom. Kendra's trouble arrived quieter, but it arrived because quiet business still leaves fingerprints when people confuse access with permission. Her agency called her in after Russell's team documented her email offering a friendly read of a manuscript she did not represent. Nobody needed to accuse her of anything dramatic, because the conflict sat right there in writing, linked to Grant, linked to me, linked to a book she had tried to reach through a side door. By evening, a Portland editor canceled lunch with Grant, and one of his authors asked Russell privately whether changing publicists would look reactive. That was how the fallout began. Not with shouting, but with professionals protecting their own distance from a bad fact. Grant sent one text to my old number, asking why I wanted to ruin him, and Trish archived it with the rest. I did not answer, because the settlement answered for me better than grief ever could after everything he had staged. The name he had treated like a footnote was now printed cleanly on contracts, catalogs, and emails he could not edit, no matter how carefully he stared. The first time I saw my book on Celeste's front table, I did not feel triumphant in the way I had imagined. The cover looked quiet, almost modest, with my name printed plainly where Grant had spent years making it feel optional. A woman near the window held one copy against her chest and whispered, "I thought I was the only one," and my hand stopped moving over the signing pen. Celeste glanced at me from behind the counter, not smiling too wide, just steady enough to remind me that peace did not need an audience. Grant tried one final email months later, careful, polished, almost humble, asking whether we could speak like two adults with history. I forwarded it to Trish without opening the attachment, because adults with history do not need surprise documents to sound sincere. Kendra left her agency quietly. Grant's client list thinned into smaller names, and Portland stopped treating his version like the safest one to repeat. None of it felt loud from where I was sitting, but every contract with my name on it proved the room had finally stopped correcting me. I built no speech around him, no victory lap, no public confession dressed as closure, because my life had become too full to keep renting space to his regret. I had a second manuscript due, a table at Celeste's store, and mornings where my coffee cooled beside pages nobody could take from me. Thank you for staying with my story until the end, especially if some part of it sounded painfully familiar. Sometimes peace begins when you stop asking the wrong person to understand your worth. So, share your thoughts below if this touched something in you. And stay close for more stories about healing, strength, and starting over.